the Kryptos fourth panel connection. In 1990, a sculpture called Kryptos was installed at CIA headquarters, containing 4 encrypted panels. 3 have been solved. The 4th remains unbroken despite decades of effort by the world's best cryptanalysts. But in 2018, researchers discovered something that had been overlooked. The sculptor, Jim Sanborn, had based portions of his code on genuine WWII encryption techniques, and specifically referenced an unbroken German message from 1945. The connection was found in CIA archives that documented Sanborn's research while creating Kryptos. He had studied OSS, Office of Strategic Services files from the war's final months, particularly focusing on German communications from the collapse of the Reich. One message, intercepted by American signals intelligence on April 27, 1945, 3 days before Hitler's suicide, had never been decoded despite multiple attempts. The message was sent from the Führer bunker in Berlin using an unknown variation of the Enigma system. It was brief, only 38 characters, but employed a plugboard configuration that didn't match any known Wehrmacht settings. Allied codebreakers attempted to decrypt it in 1945, but failed. The message was filed away, classified, and largely forgotten. Sanborn discovered this message during his CIA research and became obsessed with it. According to notes found after his death in 2018, he believed the 38-character message and the unbroken portion of Kryptos were connected, that solving one might provide the key to the other. He claimed to have identified a pattern that linked them, but never revealed what it was. The content of the 1945 message remains unknown. Given the timing, Hitler's bunker, the final days of the Reich, it could contain information about Nazi leadership escape plans, the location of assets hidden for post-war recovery, or final orders to sleeper cells. The fact that it used non-standard Enigma settings suggests it was meant for specific recipients who knew the custom configuration. Modern attempts to decrypt the message have used computational brute force that would have been impossible in 1945, but the brief length works against cryptanalysis. With only 38 characters, there isn't enough data to perform statistical frequency analysis or pattern matching. The message is too short to break through computation alone. You need insight into the encryption method itself. The Kryptos connection suggests Sanborn may have discovered something about the encryption technique. If the 4th panel of Kryptos uses the same method as the 1945 message, solving either one would reveal both. But Kryptos has resisted solution for over 30 years. And the German message has resisted for 80. Whatever they say remains locked in unbreakable code. The Laconia incident coordinates. On September 12, 1942, German U-boat U-156 torpedoed the British troopship RMS Laconia in the South Atlantic. The ship was carrying 2,700 people, including 1,800 Italian POWs. When the U-boat surfaced and discovered the survivors, Commander Werner Hartenstein began a rescue operation, broadcasting in clear language that he was rescuing survivors and requesting assistance from all ships in the area under a truce. American aircraft attacked the rescue operation, forcing Hartenstein to dive and abandon hundreds of survivors. The incident became known as the Laconia incident and led to the Laconia Order, a directive from Admiral Dönitz that German U-boats should not attempt to rescue survivors of torpedoed ships. What's less known is that during the rescue operation, U-156 sent several encrypted messages to U-boat headquarters that were intercepted by Allied listening stations, but never decoded. The messages used a variant of the naval Enigma Cipher with additional encryption layers, possibly hand-encrypted before being processed through the Enigma machine, a technique called super-encipherment. The messages were sent after the American air attack, when Hartenstein was being forced to abandon the rescue. They were brief, the longest was only 52 characters, and were transmitted in unusual circumstances that suggest urgency and importance. Allied codebreakers in 1942 couldn't decrypt them, and the messages were set aside as lower priority compared to operational intelligence. Decades later, when historians began studying the Laconia incident in detail, they rediscovered these encrypted messages in British archives. Modern cryptanalysts have attempted to break them, but the super-encipherment technique and short length have defeated all attempts. The naval Enigma settings for September 1942 are known. They were eventually broken during the war. But whatever additional encryption Hartenstein applied remains unknown. What do the messages contain? Speculation has focused on several possibilities. They might contain the exact coordinates where Hartenstein abandoned survivors, information that could have saved lives if Allied ships had conducted search operations. They might contain Hartenstein's protest to his superiors about the American attack on a rescue operation. Or they might contain information about what Hartenstein witnessed during the rescue, details about the ship's cargo, survivors' testimony, or other intelligence that he felt was important enough to encrypt beyond standard naval Enigma. Some researchers believe the messages might explain why the American aircraft attacked the rescue operation. The official explanation is that the pilots didn't recognize the rescue in progress and thought they were attacking a U-boat. But some historians have suggested the attack was deliberate, that American intelligence had reasons to want the rescue stopped. If Hartenstein's encrypted messages described something he observed during the rescue that confirmed this theory, they would be historically explosive. The coordinates where hundreds died remain unknown. The messages that might contain them remain unbroken. And the Laconia incident remains one of the war's most controversial moments, with secrets still locked in unreadable code. The Gehlen Org insurance files. As the war ended in 1945, German intelligence officer Reinhard Gehlen made a calculated decision. He microfilmed his intelligence archives, containing information on Soviet military, political operations, and agents in the West, and buried them in the Bavarian Alps. Then he surrendered to American forces and traded the location of the archives for his freedom and employment. Gehlen's organization was absorbed into U.S. intelligence and eventually became the BND, West Germany's intelligence service. What Gehlen didn't tell his American handlers was that portions of his archive were encrypted using a cipher known only to him and a few trusted associates. The encryption was his insurance policy, files that he could decrypt if he needed leverage, but that no one else could read if he was betrayed or eliminated. American intelligence discovered the encrypted files in the late 1940s when they attempted to catalog the full Gehlen archive. Gehlen claimed he had forgotten the encryption method, that it had been a personal system he'd abandoned, and that the encrypted files contained nothing of importance, just administrative records and duplicate information that existed elsewhere in unencrypted form. This was almost certainly a lie. The encrypted files were extensive, thousands of pages of microfilm, and Gehlen's organization had dedicated significant resources to encrypting them. They were too important to be duplicates or administrative trivia. But without Gehlen's cooperation, they couldn't be read. After Gehlen's death in 1979, the BND and CIA both attempted to decrypt the files. They tried every known German encryption method from the war period. They applied computational cryptanalysis. They consulted with surviving members of Gehlen's inner circle. Nothing worked. The encryption method Gehlen used remains unidentified, and modern attempts with powerful computers have made no progress. What could be so sensitive that Gehlen kept it encrypted for over 30 years, never revealing the contents even to his American and German employers? Several theories have been proposed. The files might contain names of Soviet agents and Western governments that Gehlen chose to protect rather than expose. Agents he could use for his own purposes, or agents whose exposure would compromise his position. They might contain information about Nazi war crimes that Gehlen participated in or had knowledge of, crimes he wanted buried to protect himself and his associates. They might contain financial records showing where Nazi assets were hidden, gold, art, money that could be recovered by whoever held the information. Or they might contain something more disturbing, evidence that Gehlen's intelligence on the Soviet Union was partially fabricated. Some historians have suggested that Gehlen exaggerated Soviet capabilities and intentions to make himself more valuable to American intelligence, and that the encrypted files contain the real assessments that would have revealed his deception. Whatever they contain, Gehlen considered them valuable enough to keep encrypted until his death. And despite 40+ years of cryptanalytic effort, they remain unbroken. The secrets of Nazi intelligence, buried in unbreakable code, may never be revealed. The Enigma Z Message. In May 1945, as Germany collapsed, signals intelligence stations across Europe were flooded with German military traffic. Most used standard Enigma configurations that Allied codebreakers could decrypt within hours. But on May 7, 1945, the day Germany signed the unconditional surrender, a single encrypted message was transmitted from an unknown location using an Enigma configuration designated Z in Allied records. The Z configuration didn't match any known Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, or Luftwaffe settings. It wasn't in any of the codebooks captured from German facilities. It appeared to be a completely custom Enigma setup, possibly using modified rotors or non-standard plugboard connections, that made the encryption fundamentally different from standard Enigma machines. The message was long by wartime standards, over 200 characters, suggesting significant content rather than a brief operational update. It was transmitted once on multiple frequencies simultaneously, indicating the sender wanted to ensure reception by multiple parties. And then, silence. No response was ever intercepted, no follow-up messages, no additional traffic using the Z configuration. The timing is significant. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. What message was so important that someone, presumably high-ranking given the custom encryption, felt compelled to send it on the final day, using a cipher that no Allied codebreaker could read? British and American cryptanalysts immediately recognized the Z message as unusual and prioritized it for analysis. The best minds at Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall attempted to break it. They had captured German Enigma machines. They knew the theoretical basis of the encryption, and they had the resources of the most advanced code-breaking operations in history. They failed. The Z configuration was different enough from standard Enigma that their techniques didn't work. Post-war, the message was reclassified and stored in intelligence archives. In the 1970s, when Enigma declassification began, researchers rediscovered the Z message and tried modern computational approaches. The problem was that without knowing the specific rotor settings, plugboard configuration, and any potential modifications to the machine, there were too many possible keys to test even with computers. The message remained unbreakable. Speculation about the Z message's contents has focused on several theories. It might have been a final message from Hitler's bunker before the leadership committed suicide, except the timing is wrong. Hitler died on April 30th, a week earlier. It might have been orders to stay behind units or sleeper cells, activating them for post-war resistance. It might have been coordinates for hidden assets that Nazi leadership planned to use for a Fourth Reich. One disturbing theory suggests the Z message was sent to Allied recipients, that it contained information from Nazi leaders who were negotiating separate peace deals or offering intelligence in exchange for protection. If true, the custom encryption would make sense. A cipher that neither German military nor Allied intelligence could easily read, ensuring the message reached only its intended recipients, who had been given the decryption key in advance. The Z message remains in classified archives. The encryption method remains unknown, and whatever was so important to transmit on the final day of the European War remains locked in unbreakable code. The Katyn Forest Cipher. In April 1943, German forces occupying Poland announced they had discovered mass graves in the Katyn Forest, containing the bodies of thousands of Polish officers executed with Soviet bullets. The Germans claimed it proved Soviet responsibility for the massacre. The Soviets claimed it was Nazi propaganda and that Germans had committed the murders. The truth wouldn't be officially acknowledged until 1990, when the Soviet Union finally admitted responsibility for the 1940 executions. What's less known is that during the 1943 German investigation of the Katyn site, a series of encrypted documents were found on several of the bodies. The documents appeared to be letters or orders that the Polish officers had been carrying when executed. They were written in a cipher that used the Polish alphabet but followed an encryption pattern that didn't match any known Polish military or government code of the period. The Germans attempted to decrypt the documents, hoping they would provide intelligence about Soviet operations or Polish resistance activities. They failed. The documents were photographed and copies were sent to German cryptanalysis centers, but no solution was found before the war ended. After the war, the original documents disappeared. Most likely they were confiscated by Soviet forces when they retook Poland and have been in Russian archives ever since. But the German photographic copies survived and eventually made their way to Western intelligence archives. Polish cryptanalysts have been attempting to break these encrypted documents for decades. The cipher is definitely Polish. The letter frequency patterns match Polish language statistics, but the encryption method is sophisticated and appears to use a key-dependent system where the encryption changes based on an unknown keyword or numerical key. What could be in these documents that required encryption? The officers carrying them were being transported from Soviet prison camps to the execution site. If they were carrying encrypted documents, those documents must have been in their possession when they were captured by Soviet forces in 1939-1940. That means the encryption was applied before their capture, while Poland was still fighting. The most likely explanation is that the documents contained military intelligence or resistance plans that the officers were trying to protect from German or Soviet capture. They might contain names of Polish agents, details of underground networks, or plans for continued resistance that the officers hoped would survive even if they didn't. Or they might contain something more personal, encrypted diaries, letters to families, or testimonies about what they had witnessed during the Soviet occupation. Some researchers believe the documents might contain evidence of Soviet atrocities that the officers witnessed before their own executions, evidence they encrypted in hope that someday someone would be able to read it and reveal the truth. The Katyn massacre is no longer a secret. Soviet responsibility is acknowledged, but the encrypted documents from the forest remain unbroken. Whatever those Polish officers thought was important enough to carry to their deaths, written in cipher to protect it from their executors, remains unread 80 years later. The Churchill-Roosevelt private line. Throughout WWII, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt communicated constantly, by letter, telegram, and eventually through a secure telephone line called Sigsali. But recently declassified documents reveal that the two leaders also used a separate, private encryption method for messages they wanted to keep secret even from their own intelligence services. The existence of this private cipher was discovered in the 1990s when researchers studying Churchill's papers at the Imperial War Museum found references to private communications that used a personal cipher agreed upon with the president. Follow-up research in American archives revealed that Roosevelt's personal secretary had instructions for handling PM POTUS private cipher messages that bypass normal State Department and military channels. Several of these privately encrypted messages survived in archives, but the cipher used to encrypt them did not. Both leaders took the encryption method to their graves. Roosevelt died in April 1945, and Churchill never revealed the system during his remaining 20 years of life. The messages are distinctive in appearance. They consist of 5-letter groups like standard diplomatic cipher, but analysis shows they don't match any known Allied encryption system from the period. The letter frequency is unusual, too flat to be simple substitution, but with patterns that suggest a more sophisticated system than random one-time pad. Why would Churchill and Roosevelt need a private cipher? They had access to the most secure communication systems available. Sigsali was considered unbreakable. Standard diplomatic ciphers were highly secure. What could they have been discussing that required additional secrecy? Historians have speculated about several possibilities. The messages might have contained discussions about post-war spheres of influence that the two leaders wanted to negotiate without their government's knowledge. They might have discussed intelligence from sources that were too sensitive to share with their own intelligence agencies. They might have contained personal information or opinions about allies, subordinates, or military operations that they didn't want leaked. One dark theory suggests the private cipher was used for discussions about operations that both leaders wanted deniable, covert actions that, if exposed, they could claim no knowledge of. The timing of some of the encrypted messages correlates with controversial operations, whose authorization has never been definitively established. The most intriguing encrypted message dates from July 1944, shortly after D-Day. It's longer than usual, over 300 5-letter groups, and was sent from Churchill to Roosevelt, marked Private Cipher, Destroy after reading. Roosevelt did not destroy it. His secretary filed it, and it remains in archives at the FDR Presidential Library. The message's timing has led to speculation that it discusses Operation Unthinkable, Churchill's controversial plan for an immediate offensive against the Soviet Union after Germany's defeat. The plan was developed in May-June 1944, and Churchill would have needed Roosevelt's support to implement it. The encrypted message might contain Churchill's arguments for the operation and Roosevelt's response, or it might contain something entirely different, something both leaders wanted kept secret, not just from enemies, but from their own governments and posterity. Without the cipher key, we'll never know. The private communications between two of history's most consequential leaders remain locked in unbreakable code. The Odessa network coordinates. In the final months of WWII and the immediate aftermath, thousands of Nazi officials, SS officers, and war criminals escaped Germany through rat lines, secret escape routes to South America, the Middle East, and other safe havens. The network that facilitated these escapes has been called Odessa, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, though debate continues about whether Odessa was a formal organization or a loose network of sympathizers. What's certain is that the escape network used encrypted communications to coordinate its operations. In 1946-1947, Allied intelligence intercepted dozens of encrypted messages that analysis suggested were related to Nazi escape activities. The messages used a cipher that didn't match any known German military or intelligence codes, suggesting it was specifically developed for post-war clandestine operations. The messages typically contained combinations of numbers and code words. Cryptanalysts believe the numbers represented geographical coordinates and dates, while the code words might indicate individuals, resources, or operational instructions. But without the cipher key and codebook, the messages couldn't be fully decoded. Some partial breaks were achieved. Allied codebreakers determined that certain code words consistently appeared in messages correlated with known escape events. Perseus appeared in messages sent shortly before several high-ranking Nazis reached Argentina. Falcon appeared before escapes to Syria. Raven before escapes to Spain. But the exact meaning of these code words, whether they represented people, routes, or operations, remained unclear. The numerical portions of the messages completely resisted decryption. They appeared to be coordinates, but the encryption method made them unusable. Without knowing the cipher, the coordinates might be anywhere in the world, encoded in any of a dozen possible formats. Post-war, as the magnitude of Nazi escapes became clear, the encrypted messages took on new significance. If they could be decrypted, they might reveal who escaped, where they went, who helped them, and what resources they took with them. They might lead to hidden Nazi assets, gold looted from victims, artwork stolen from museums, diamonds, and cash hidden for post-war recovery. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and Beate Klarsfeld tracked down war criminals in South America, they requested access to the encrypted messages, hoping they might contain leads. Intelligence agencies provided some access, but the messages remained unbreakable. One message from December 1946 has been the focus of particular attention. It's longer than usual, nearly 400 characters, and contains 15 sets of number groups that cryptanalysts believe are coordinates. The message was intercepted being transmitted from Genoa, Italy to Buenos Aires, Argentina, a known ratline endpoint. If the coordinates could be decrypted, they might represent locations where escaping Nazis planned to hide, regroup, or store assets. The cipher used for these Odessa messages appears to be a hand cipher, something that could be encrypted and decrypted with just pencil, paper, and a key that could be memorized. This makes sense for clandestine operations where carrying cipher machines would be dangerous, but it also means the cipher is potentially breakable if the method can be identified. Despite 75 Plea years of effort, the Odessa network messages remain largely undecrypted. The coordinates remain unknown. And somewhere in South America, the Middle East, or hidden caches around the world, assets placed by escaping Nazis might still be waiting, their locations locked in unbreakable code. The Navajo Code. Within the code. The Navajo code talkers are famous for using their native language to create an unbreakable code for Marine Corps communications in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese never broke the Navajo code because they had no access to the language and couldn't identify what language they were even listening to. But what's less known is that within the Navajo code system, there was an additional encrypted layer for the most sensitive communications, and portions of those doubly encrypted messages were never decoded, even by the Navajo code talkers themselves. The standard Navajo code worked by using Navajo words to represent English letters and military terms. The code talkers could translate messages in both directions. But for certain ultra-sensitive communications, messages containing atomic weapons information, high-level strategic plans, or intelligence source identification, the messages were first encrypted using a standard military cipher before being translated into Navajo. This created a situation where the Navajo code talker receiving the message could translate it from Navajo back into English, but the resulting English text was still encrypted and needed a separate cipher key to read. The code talker would then pass the encrypted English text to an officer with the appropriate clearance and cipher materials. In at least 2 cases, the officers who possessed the cipher keys were killed before they could decrypt the messages. The encrypted English text was filed in archives, and the messages have never been read. The first incident occurred on Iwo Jima in February 1945. A code talker translated a lengthy Navajo message and passed the resulting encrypted English text to a Marine intelligence officer. The officer was killed by artillery fire minutes later, and the cipher materials he carried were destroyed. The encrypted message was eventually filed in archives, but no record could be found of what cipher system was used, or where other copies of the cipher key might be. The second incident occurred on Okinawa in June 1945. A high-priority message was transmitted in double encrypted form, encrypted in English, then translated to Navajo. The receiving code talker successfully translated it back to encrypted English, but the officer who was supposed to decrypt it was on a ship that was sunk by a kamikaze attack. The cipher key went down with the ship. What could these messages have contained that required double encryption? The timing is suggestive. The Iwo Jima message was sent 3 weeks before the island was declared secure. It might have contained intelligence about the island's remaining defenses or Japanese plans. The Okinawa message was sent just weeks before the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It might have contained information about the weapon, target selection, or invasion alternatives. Both messages remain in Marine Corps archives. The Navajo translation was successful. The encrypted English text is readable, but the English cipher was never identified, and the messages remain unreadable. The code talkers who transmitted and received them are all deceased. The officers who held the cipher keys are dead. Whatever information was important enough to require double encryption in the final months of the Pacific War remains locked in unbreakable code. The Warsaw Uprising Plea. On August 1, 1944, the Polish resistance launched the Warsaw Uprising, a planned 48-hour operation to liberate the city from German occupation before Soviet forces arrived. The uprising lasted 63 days before being crushed. Over 200,000 Poles died, most of them civilians. The Soviets, who had reached the outskirts of Warsaw, refused to advance or provide support, watching from across the Vistula River as the Germans destroyed the city and the resistance. During the uprising, Polish forces sent dozens of encrypted messages to their government in exile in London and to Allied commands requesting air support, supplies, and assistance. Many of these messages were successfully decrypted and forwarded to British and American leadership, but one message, sent on September 10, 1944, as the uprising entered its final desperate stage, was never successfully decoded. The message was long, over 1,000 characters, and used a cipher that didn't match any known Polish resistance code. Analysis suggested it might have been encrypted using a one-time pad, which would make it mathematically unbreakable without the pad. But why would the resistance use a one-time pad for this message when they had standard codes that were working for all other communications? The timing and length suggest the message contained something beyond a standard plea for assistance. It was sent as German forces were systematically destroying what remained of the resistance and beginning mass deportations of survivors. It was sent after it became clear the Soviets would not intervene. And it was sent on a date that Polish historians recognize as the point when resistance leaders knew the uprising was lost. Polish cryptanalysts and historians have been trying to break this message for 80 years. The message is in Polish military archives, and copies exist in British files. Multiple attempts with different cipher-breaking approaches have failed. If it was indeed encrypted with a one-time pad, it's unbreakable without the pad itself. which has never been found. What could be so sensitive that resistance fighters in the midst of a losing battle would use their most secure encryption method? Several theories exist. The message might have been a detailed account of Soviet behavior, evidence that the Soviets were deliberately allowing the Germans to destroy the non-communist Polish resistance before entering the city. This would have been valuable intelligence for the Polish government in exile and Western allies, explaining Soviet intentions for post-war Poland. It might have contained allegations about who was responsible for the uprising's failure, internal accusations, evidence of betrayal, or intelligence about which resistance factions had been compromised. Making such accusations in readable form would have been politically explosive. Or it might have been a final testimony, a detailed record of atrocities witnessed, war crimes committed, civilian deaths deliberately inflicted. The resistance leaders might have encrypted it to protect those named within it, knowing that if the message fell into German or Soviet hands in readable form, the people identified would be targeted for retribution. The message was intercepted by British signals intelligence and forwarded to London. It was catalogued, attempted, and filed. The Polish senders were killed in the uprising's final days. The cipher key was lost. And whatever the Polish resistance felt was important enough to encrypt in their final desperate hours remains unread, locked in unbreakable code. The Black Orchestra Testament. The Schwarze Kapelle, Black Orchestra, was the name given to the network of German military officers, government officials, and civilians who plotted to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. The most famous attempt was the July 20th, 1944 bombing at the Wolf's Lair, which failed when Hitler survived. The conspirators were arrested and executed. The Black Orchestra was destroyed. But before the July 20th attempt, members of the conspiracy had prepared for the possibility of failure. They encrypted a detailed document, sometimes called the Black Orchestra Testament, that contained names of all conspirators, plans for the post-Hitler government, evidence of Nazi crimes they had documented, and their justification for attempting to kill the head of state. The encrypted document was hidden in multiple locations. The Gestapo found and destroyed most copies during the mass arrests following the failed assassination. But one copy survived, discovered in 1955 during renovation of a building in Berlin that had been damaged during the war. The document was behind a false wall, sealed in a waterproof container. The document was photographed and turned over to West German authorities. It consists of approximately 50 pages of typewritten text that has been encrypted using an unknown cipher. The cipher is sophisticated, not a simple substitution or transposition, but something that resisted immediate cryptanalysis. West German intelligence attempted to decrypt the document in the 1950s and 1960s. After reunification, the BND made additional attempts with more sophisticated computational methods. The cipher has never been broken. Why would the Black Orchestra conspirators use such strong encryption for a document they intended to be read if they failed? The answer is timing. The document was encrypted to prevent it being read immediately after a failed coup, when the regime would still be hunting conspirators and executing anyone connected to the plot. The encryption was meant to delay reading until the war ended and the Nazi regime fell, when the document could be decrypted safely. The conspirators almost certainly created a key or instructions for decryption that were supposed to be preserved separately. But, with the mass executions after July 20th, 1944, anyone who knew the decryption method was killed. The document survived, but the key to reading it did not. What could the Black Orchestra Testament contain? Based on what survived in unencrypted form, interrogation transcripts, letters, and memoirs, we know the conspirators had documented extensive evidence of Nazi atrocities. They had lists of SS officers responsible for specific crimes. They had evidence of military complicity and genocide. They had plans for trials and accountability. But the encrypted document might contain something more personal and dangerous. Names of conspirators who survived. The Black Orchestra was larger than the group arrested after July 20th. Some members remained hidden, their involvement never discovered by the Gestapo. The encrypted document might name them, identifying them as heroes of the resistance, but also exposing them to post-war scrutiny about why they survived when others were executed. It might also contain accusations about officials who claimed to oppose Hitler, but who betrayed the conspiracy or refused to participate. In post-war Germany, many people claim to have resisted the Nazi regime. The Black Orchestra Testament might contain the truth about who actually did. The document remains in German archives, still encrypted. The conspirators who created it are long dead, and whatever testimony they left about their attempt to stop Hitler from within remains locked in unbreakable code. These 10 messages share a disturbing quality. They were important enough to encrypt with the strongest methods available, but they were never decoded before the people who could read them died or disappeared. The secrets they contain, coordinates, names, confessions, intelligence, remain locked behind unbreakable ciphers that have defeated 80 years of cryptanalytic effort. Some of these messages could still matter today. The Odessa network coordinates might lead to hidden Nazi assets. The Black Orchestra Testament might name resistors who have never been acknowledged. The Churchill-Roosevelt private cipher might contain discussions about post-war decisions that still affect international relations. The Warsaw Uprising Plea might contain testimony about Soviet complicity that remains politically sensitive. Others are purely historical, but no less fascinating. What did the Enigma Z message say that was important enough to transmit on the final day of the war? What intelligence did Gehlen keep encrypted as insurance? What did the Polish officers carry to their executions in Katyn Forest? Modern cryptanalysis can break many historical ciphers that were unbreakable in their time. Computational power has increased exponentially. Machine learning algorithms can detect patterns that human analysts miss. But these 10 messages have resisted every modern technique. They represent something rare, secrets that may genuinely remain secret forever. The problem isn't just the encryption strength, it's the missing context. Without knowing what cipher system was used, even a short message becomes nearly impossible to break. With one-time pads, the message is mathematically unbreakable without the pad. With custom encryption methods that were never written down, there's nothing to attack. These messages also remind us that history is incomplete. We think we know what happened during WWII because we've read the documents, interviewed the survivors, and studied the evidence. But scattered through archives around the world are encrypted messages that no one can read, gaps in the historical record that might change our understanding if they could be decoded. What did they say? We'll probably never know. The people who could decrypt them are dead. The cipher keys are lost. The technology that might break them doesn't exist yet, and may never exist. These are secrets that will remain secrets, words written in wartime, encrypted for protection, and now locked forever beyond human ability to read. 10 messages, 10 unbreakable codes, 10 secrets from history's deadliest war that remain, even 80 years later, exactly what they were meant to be. Secret.